Hey everyone, welcome back to Mr. Not Horror. If you're ready for a story that'll give you chills, make sure to like, subscribe, and let us know where you're listening from in the comments. Now, get cozy, relax, and let's begin today's spooky tale. The road into Hollow Creek was a narrow, winding path, flanked by dense woods that seemed to swallow the sunlight. I arrived in the late afternoon, my car tires crunching over gravel, as I passed the weathered town sign that read Hollow Creek, population 312. The air felt thick, oppressive, as though the town itself exhaled a heavy sigh of warning. My mission was simple: document the strange stories that clung to towns like this, forgotten places where the line between folklore and reality blurred. I parked outside a diner that looked like it hadn't been touched since the 1950s. Inside, the locals avoided my gaze, whispering amongst themselves. I approached the counter where a wiry old man wiped a glass that already looked clean enough. "Passing through?" he asked, his voice a low rasp. "Actually, I'm here to ask about the cemetery," I said. That got their attention. Conversation ceased, and all eyes turned to me. The old man stiffened. "Best not go stirring up trouble. Ain't nothing there you want to see." "That's not what I've heard," I replied, pulling out my notebook. "People say there's wailing at night, that it drives folks mad." "You heard wrong," he snapped, then leaned in close. "Some things don't need investigating, son. Leave it be." I thanked him and left, feeling the weight of their stares as I walked out. But I hadn't driven all this way to be scared off by cryptic warnings. I found the cemetery at the edge of town, surrounded by a rusted iron fence that groaned in the breeze. The headstones were old, many of them tilted or covered in moss. A gnarled oak tree stood in the center, its branches spreading like skeletal arms over the graves. The air smelled of damp earth and decay. As I wandered through, reading the faded inscriptions, I noticed something odd. Many of the graves were marked with the same date of death, November 13th, 1958. Rows of them. "What happened here?" said I murmured, pulling out my phone to snap a picture. "You won't find answers with that thing." I jumped at the voice. A woman stood behind me, her dark hair tied in a messy bun, her face pale and lined with worry. She looked out of place, wearing a modern raincoat against the chill. "Sorry, I didn't mean to startle you," she said. "I'm Clara." "Elliot," I said, lowering my phone. "You know about the wailing?" Her expression darkened. "More than I'd like to. My husband, he was buried here last. Ever since I've heard it every night, calling to." "Calling you?" She nodded. "I've tried to ignore it, but it's getting louder. I can't sleep. I think it's trying to pull me in." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Do you know what causes it?" The road into Hollow Creek was a narrow, winding path, flanked by dense woods that seemed to swallow the sunlight. I arrived in the late afternoon, my car tires crunching over gravel, as I passed the weathered town sign that read Hollow Creek, population 312. The air felt thick, oppressive, as though the town itself exhaled a heavy sigh of warning. My mission was simple: document the strange stories that clung to towns like this, forgotten places where the line between folklore and reality blurred. I parked outside a diner that looked like it hadn't been touched since the 1950s. Inside, the locals avoided my gaze, whispering amongst them. I approached the counter, where a wiry old man wiped a glass that already looked clean enough. "Passing through?" he asked, his voice a low rasp. "Actually, I'm here to ask about the cemetery." That got their attention. Conversation ceased, and all eyes turned to me. The old man stiffened. "Best not go stirring up trouble. Ain't nothing there you want to see." "That's not what I've heard," I replied, pulling out my notebook. "People say there's wailing at night, that it drives folks mad." "You heard wrong," he snapped, then leaned in close. "Some things don't need investigating. Leave it be." I thanked him and left, feeling the weight of their stares as I walked out. But I hadn't driven all this way to be scared off by cryptic warnings. I found the cemetery at the edge of town, surrounded by a rusted iron fence that groaned in the breeze. The headstones were old, many of them tilted or covered in moss. A gnarled oak tree stood in the center, its branches spreading like skeletal arms over the graves. The air smelled of damp earth and decay. As I wandered through, reading the faded inscriptions, I noticed something odd. Many of the graves were marked with the same date of death, November 13th, 1958. Rows of them. "What happened here?" I murmured, pulling out my phone to snap a picture. "You won't find answers with that thing." I jumped at the voice. A woman stood behind me, her dark hair tied in a messy bun, her face pale and lined with worry. She looked out of place, wearing a modern raincoat against the chill. "Sorry, I didn't mean to startle you," she said. "I'm Clara." "Elliot," I said, lowering my phone. "You know about the wailing?" Her expression darkened. "More than I'd like to. My husband, he was buried here last year. Ever since, I've heard it every night. Calling to." "Calling you?" She nodded. "I've tried to ignore it, but it's getting louder. I can't sleep. I think it's trying to pull me in." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Do you know what causes it?" "Clara Carter," he said. "She died 6 months ago, buried right there in that cemetery." I stared at him, my heart pounding. That's not possible. I spoke to her yesterday. She showed me her husband's grave. The old man frowned. She didn't have a husband. Clara never married. Are you sure you're feeling all right? I stumbled out of the diner, my mind racing. Back at the cemetery, I found the grave she'd shown me. It bore her name, Clara Carter, beloved daughter, 1983 to 2020. As I stared at the headstone, the wailing began again, louder this, and I could swear I heard her voice among the cries. I didn't stay in Hollow Creek long after that, but even now, miles away, I still hear it at night, the mournful, unending wail, and sometimes in my dreams, I see her face. She's always standing beneath that tree, watching, waiting, and when I wake, I feel the pull, as if the cemetery's calling me back. I fear that one day I won't be able to. The road into Red Hollow was cracked and uneven, bordered by tall reeds that whispered against the wind. As I drove closer to the heart of the town, an unsettling sense of abandonment crept over me. Buildings sagged with age, paint peeling in long strips, and the air smelled faintly of rust and decay. This was where the infamous carnival was said to reappear, a cursed fairground that had haunted the town for decades. The stories were vague, passed down in hushed tones by those who dared to speak of it. Every 13 years, the carnival would return, bringing with it a wave of disappearances. No one who entered its gates after dark ever came back. I parked my car near the town square, which was eerily deserted. A cold wind rattled the shutters of an old general store, and for a moment I thought I saw movement inside. But when I stepped closer, I found only shadows. Looking for the carnival? A voice asked from behind me. I turned to see an old man sitting on a bench, his face lined with deep wrinkles, his eyes clouded but sharp. I am, I admitted. Do you know where it appears? He chuckled dryly, shaking his head. You're a fool if you're thinking of going there. It's not for the living. I'm a writer, I said, pulling out my notebook. I document stories like this. If there's truth to the legend, I want to see it for myself. The old man's expression darkened. You won't find truth there, only regret. But if you're dead set on it, head to the edge of town by nightfall. You'll hear it before you see it. I thanked him, though his words left me with a sense of unease. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I drove to the outskirts of Red Hollow, parking near an overgrown field. The night was unnervingly quiet, the air heavy with anticipation. Then I heard it, a distant melody, faint and lilting, carried on the wind. I followed the sound on foot, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The music grew louder, more distinct, the cheerful notes of a calliope mingled with the faint laughter of children. A glow appeared ahead, flickering like a mirage. As I crested a hill, I saw it, the carnival. Brightly colored tents and glowing lights stretched across the field, the Ferris wheel towering above the treetops. It looked alive, vibrant, a stark contrast to the desolation of the town. But as I stepped closer, I realized something was wrong. The laughter didn't sound quite right, too high-pitched, too hollow, as if it were being played on a loop. The calliope music had an eerie undertone, a dissonance that made my skin crawl. I hesitated at the entrance, my instincts screaming at me to turn back. But curiosity pushed me forward. The carnival was eerily empty. Stalls offered prizes that looked worn and strange, a faded doll with mismatched eyes, a tarnished locket, a stuffed animal that seemed to shift slightly when I looked away. The rides spun without passengers, their machinery groaning like old bones. "Step right up," a voice called, startling me. I turned to see a man in a pinstriped suit standing by a game booth. His face was pale, almost waxy, his smile too wide. "Try your luck. Win a prize." "No, thanks," I said, backing away. His smile didn't falter. "Suit yourself. But everyone plays eventually." I walked quickly past him, my unease growing. The deeper I ventured into the carnival, the stranger it became. The funhouse mirrors reflected distorted versions of it, elongated, broken, and lifeless. The carousel spun in slow, creaking circles, its painted horses snarling instead of smiling. As I neared the Ferris wheel, I saw a figure sitting on one of the benches. It was a little girl, her hair in pigtails, clutching a stuffed rabbit. "Are you lost?" I asked, approaching cautiously. She looked up at me with wide, unblinking eyes. "You shouldn't be here." Before I could respond, she pointed behind me. I turned and froze. The carnival workers were gathering, their faces eerily identical, their eyes glinting in the dim light. They didn't speak, but their expressions said enough. I wasn't supposed to leave. "Run," the girl whispered. I didn't hesitate. I sprinted toward the entrance, my heart pounding. The laughter and music grew louder, disorienting, and I stumbled as the ground seemed to shift beneath me. The workers were closing in, their movements unnatural, almost puppet-like. When I reached the entrance, it was gone. In its place was a wall of darkness, impenetrable, suffocating. Panic clawed at my throat as I turned in circles, searching for an escape. "Stay!" a voice hissed, low and guttural. I looked up to see the man in the pinstriped suit standing before me, his smile now a grotesque grin that stretched across his entire face. His eyes were black voids, endless and hungry. "This is where you belong now," he said, his voice echoing in my head. "No," I shouted, pushing past him. I don't know how I found my way out, but suddenly I was back in the field, the carnival nowhere in sight. The silence was deafening and the air felt thin, as if the world had been holding its breath. I stumbled back to my car and drove until the town was far behind me. But even now, I can still hear the faint melody of the calliope at night, a reminder that the carnival isn't gone. It's waiting, and I know that one day it will come for me, just as it has for so many others. I never believed in curses, not until I inherited my uncle's cabin in the remote town of Black Hollow. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a place to escape the chaos of the city and clear my head. But from the moment I arrived, something felt wrong. The cabin was perched on the edge of a dense forest, its wooden walls darkened with age and neglect. The locals had been polite but distant when I asked for directions, their faces shadowed with unease. They spoke in vague warnings, muttering about keeping the curtains closed after dark and never leaving the lights off for too long. At first, I brushed it off as small-town superstition. The cabin itself wasn't in terrible shape, though the air inside carried a faint, acrid smell I couldn't place. I chalked it up to mildew and opened the windows, hoping the fresh air would help. It was on the second night that I heard it, the sound of knocking. It came just after midnight, faint but distinct. At first, I thought it was the wind rattling the shutters, but as I lay in bed, straining to listen, the knocks grew louder, more deliberate. 3 slow knocks, followed by silence. I got up and checked the front door, but no one was there. The forest beyond the porch was still, the trees swaying gently in the night breeze. Telling myself it was nothing, I locked the door and went back to bed. The knocking continued the next night. This time, it came from the back door. Again, there was no one there, only the oppressive darkness of the woods. My unease grew, but I refused to give in to fear. By the 4th night, the knocking was accompanied by something far worse. I had been sitting in the living room, reading by the light of a single lamp, when I heard a faint scraping sound coming from the kitchen. It was a slow, deliberate noise, like fingernails dragging across wood. I grabbed a flashlight and crept toward the sound, my heart hammering in my chest. The kitchen was empty, the door to the pantry slightly ajar. Taking a deep breath, I opened it, shining the light inside. Nothing. As I closed the pantry door, the scraping started again, this time from the living room. I spun around, but there was nothing there, just the lamp, flickering faintly. I barely slept that night, and when morning came, I decided to visit the town library, hoping to find some explanation for the strange occurrences. The librarian, an older woman with kind eyes, seemed hesitant to speak at first, but when I mentioned the cabin, her face turned pale. "You should leave," she said, her voice trembling. "Why?" I asked. "What's going on?" She hesitated, then leaned in close. "That cabin, it's cursed. People say it was built on unmarked graves. No one knows who they were or why they died. But strange things have always happened there. The knocking, the sounds. It's them, trying to get in." "Trying to get in?" I repeated, a chill running down my spine. She nodded. "They're restless, and if you let them in, they'll never leave." I wanted to dismiss her words as nonsense, but the fear in her eyes was undeniable. That night, I locked every door and window, drawing the curtains tightly shut. I sat in the living room, clutching a flashlight, waiting for the knocking to start. It came at exactly midnight. This time, it was louder, more insistent. The knocks echoed through the cabin, coming from every direction, doors, windows, even the walls. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice trembling. The knocking stopped. For a moment, the silence was deafening. Then I heard it, a voice faint and distorted, like a whisper carried on the wind. "Let us in." My blood ran cold. The voice didn't sound human. It was layered, as though multiple people were speaking at once. I backed away, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The walls seemed to pulse, the air growing thick and suffocating. The knocking resumed, more frenzied this time, as though whatever was outside was desperate to get in. And then I saw it, a face pressed against the window, pale and gaunt, its eyes hollow and black. It stared at me with an intensity that made my knees buckle. Behind it, more faces appeared, dozens of them, all staring, all waiting. The lights flickered, and the room grew colder. I stumbled back, tripping over the coffee table, and landed hard on the floor. The flashlight rolled away, its beam illuminating the faces for just a moment before the bulb shattered, plunging the cabin into darkness. The knocking turned into pounding, the voices growing louder. "Let us in." I crawled toward the bedroom, slamming the door shut behind me. I huddled in the corner, clutching my knees as the pounding grew deafening. The walls shook and the air filled with a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I don't know when I passed out, but when I woke, it was morning. The cabin was eerily quiet, the sunlight streaming through the cracks in the curtains. I didn't wait to find out if they'd return. I packed my things and left, driving away from Black Hollow as fast as I could. Even now, I can't explain what happened in that cabin. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the faint sound of knocking, 3 slow, deliberate knocks, and I wonder if I'll ever truly escape them. The old bridge outside of Pinewood was a place of whispered legend. It wasn't much to look at, just a rotting wooden structure spanning a slow, murky creek. But the locals claimed it was cursed. They called it the Bridge of Echoes, and everyone in town knew the rule. Never cross it after sunset, never linger, and above all, never speak a word while on it. I didn't believe in curses or ghost stories. When I moved to Pinewood for a quieter life, the tales about the bridge felt like quaint folklore, nothing more. But curiosity is a dangerous thing. It started with a dare. My friend Mike, who had lived in Pinewood his whole life, had taken me to the bar one evening. After a few beers, he leaned in with a grin. "You know about the bridge, don't you?" he asked. "Yeah, I've heard the stories," I shrugged. "People say it's haunted or cursed or something." Mike's grin widened. "How about you prove it's just a story? Go there tonight, cross it, and call out your name. If nothing happens, drinks are on me for a month." I laughed. "That's it? Easy." The other guys at the bar joined, egging. Their laughter and jeers felt harmless, but as the night went on, a strange tension. There was something in their eyes. Fear, maybe, or guilt. It only made me more determined. I left around midnight, my head buzzing from the alcohol and the adrenaline. The drive to the bridge was short, but the narrow road was unsettling. The trees lining it were dense, their gnarled branches forming shadowy arches over the asphalt. When I arrived, the air felt colder than it should have. The bridge loomed ahead, its planks dark and warped with age. A mist clung to the water below, curling around the supports like ghostly fingers. I stepped out of the car, my breath visible in the chill. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint trickle of the creek. My phone flashlight cast long, jagged shadows, making the scene feel even more surreal. Standing at the edge of the bridge, I hesitated. The stories rushed back to me. People who crossed it at night disappearing, or returning with blank stares, and no memory of who they were. "Just a story," I muttered to myself. I stepped onto the bridge. The wood creaked beneath my weight, each step echoing unnaturally, as if the sound were bouncing back from something unseen. Halfway across, I stopped, the dare replaying in my mind. "Call your name," I was trying to laugh off the... Taking a deep breath, I shouted, "Ethan!" "My name is Ethan." The echoes came back almost instantly, but they weren't quite right. The first repetition sounded normal, but the next was slower, distorted. By the third, it wasn't my voice anymore. It was deeper, guttural, like something mimicking me. I froze, my heart pounding. The air around me felt heavier, thicker, as though the bridge were alive and breathing. Then I heard it, a soft rustling behind me, like footsteps on dry leaves. I whipped around, but there was nothing there. The mist had grown denser, swirling around the edges of the bridge. The rustling grew louder, closer, joined by faint whispers. "Who's there?" I called, my voice shaking. The whispers stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, pressing in on my ears. Then, from the far end of the bridge, a figure emerged from the fog. It was tall and thin, its movements jerky and unnatural, as though it didn't quite know how to walk. Its face was obscured by shadows, but its eyes glowed faintly, like embers in the dark. "Ethan," it said, its voice a warped echo of mine. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the even planks. The figure moved closer, its steps soundless, despite the creaking of... "Ethan," repeated, stretching the... Panic surged through me, and I turned to run. The bridge seemed longer than before, the far end impossibly far away. My legs felt heavy, as though the air itself were holding me back. Behind me, the whispers returned, louder now, overlapping in a chaotic chorus. They weren't words, not exactly, but the sounds crawled under my skin, filling me with a primal fear. I reached the end of the bridge and threw myself into the car, slamming the door shut. My hands fumbled with the keys, the engine sputtering to life, just as a shadow passed across the windshield. I didn't look back. I drove until the bridge and the forest were far behind me, my mind racing with what I had seen. When I got home, I locked every door and window, checking them twice. But as I sat in the silence of my living room, trying to calm my nerves, I heard it again. "Ethan!" The voice came from outside, faint but unmistakable. My blood ran cold as I realized it wasn't coming from the direction of the bridge. It was coming from the backyard. I didn't sleep that night, and the next day, I packed my things and left Pinewood for good. But no matter how far I go, the whispers follow. I hear them in the dead of night, calling my name, and I know that one day I'll have to answer. When I first saw the farmhouse, it seemed like the perfect escape. Nestled on the outskirts of a forgotten little town, it was far removed from the noise and chaos of city life. The price was suspiciously low, but the real estate agent explained it away. No one's lived here in years. It just needs a little love. It was more than I had bargained for. The paint was peeling, the shutters hung crookedly, and the fields surrounding it were overgrown with weeds. But the isolation called to me. After a recent breakup and months of feeling like a stranger in my own life, I needed space to breathe, to think. The first week was uneventful. I spent my days cleaning and unpacking, listening to the hum of cicadas in the summer heat. At night, the farmhouse was eerily silent, but I found the stillness comforting until the seventh night. It started with a noise in the attic. I was in the kitchen washing dishes when I heard it, a faint scuffling sound like footsteps dragging across the wooden floor above me. I froze, staring at the ceiling. Probably mice, I muttered, trying to calm my nerves. But as the night wore on, the sounds grew louder. Footsteps turned into thuds, and I swore I heard the creak of furniture being moved. The next morning, I ventured into the attic. Dust swirled in the beam of my flashlight, and the air was thick with the smell of mildew. The space was mostly empty, save for a few broken chairs and an old trunk shoved into the far corner. Curiosity got the better of me. The trunk was locked, but the rusty hinges gave way with a little effort. Inside, I found a collection of photographs, brittle with age. They were black and white, showing a family, parents, and two children, posing stiffly in front of the farmhouse. One photo in particular caught my eye. It was a close-up of the children, a boy and a girl. The girl had a vacant, unsettling stare, her eyes too wide, her smile forced. The boy, on the other hand, looked angry, almost resentful. Underneath the photos was a diary, its leather cover cracked and faded. The entries were written in a child's scrawl, recounting mundane details of farm life. But as I flipped through the pages, the tone grew darker. Mama says we can't go into the woods any. She says they're watching us. The man came back last night. He stood outside my window, but when I told Mama, she said it was just a bad dream. Tommy says the man isn't real, but I know he's lying. I heard him talking to him in the barn. The final entry was smeared and barely legible. They want us to go with them. Mama says we have to stay quiet, but I'm scared. I think Tommy let them in. A chill ran down my spine. I shoved the diary back into the trunk and climbed down, trying to shake off the unease. But that night, the noises started again. This time, they weren't confined to the attic. I heard faint whispers, unintelligible but persistent, drifting through the walls. The footsteps seemed to circle my bedroom, stopping just outside the door. I didn't sleep. The next day, I called the real estate agent, demanding answers. She hesitated before finally admitting that the farmhouse had a history. A family disappeared here about 50 years ago, she said reluctantly. No one knows what happened to them. The locals think the woods are cursed, but, well, it's just stories. I hung up, more determined than ever to leave. That evening, as I packed my bags, I noticed something strange. The photos I'd found in the attic were now sitting on the dining table. I hadn't brought them down. I stared at them, my hands trembling. The children's faces seemed different, more lifelike, their expressions twisted into something between a smile and a sneer. A sudden knock at the back door made me jump. I turned, heart pounding, but the yard was empty. The knocking came again, louder this time, followed by a voice. "Let us in!" It was soft, childlike, but it carried an edge that made my skin crawl. I backed away, my chest tightening. The voice came again, now from the front door. "Please, we're cold." Shaking, I grabbed my keys and bolted for the car. As I fumbled with the door, I glanced back at the house. Two figures stood in the window, watching me. The boy and the girl from the photographs. Their faces were pale, their eyes hollow and black. The boy raised a hand and pressed it to the glass, his lips moving silently. I didn't wait to see what he was saying. I drove through the night, not stopping until I reached the next town. When I finally pulled over at a motel, my hands were still shaking. I tried to tell myself it was over, that I was safe. But when I closed my eyes, I saw their faces. And sometimes, in the stillness of the night, I hear it again, a faint knock and a whisper at the door. "Let us in." I moved to the town of Stillwater after inheriting my late aunt's home. It was a modest, two-story house on the edge of a quiet neighborhood, surrounded by dense woods. The town itself was small, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone. I didn't mind the isolation. It felt like a fresh start. The house had its quirks. The floors creaked no matter how lightly I walked, and some of the windows didn't close all the way. But the oddest thing was the basement. My aunt had always kept it locked, and now, even with the keys she left me, the door wouldn't budge. At first, I thought nothing of it. Maybe she'd lost the key, or maybe the wood had warped over time. But as the days passed, the basement began to weigh on me. Every night, just past midnight, I'd hear faint noises coming from below, soft thuds, like something knocking on the walls. I told myself it was the house settling, that old homes made strange noises. But deep down, I wasn't convinced. One evening, I mentioned it to my neighbor, Mrs. Calloway, an elderly woman who had lived in Stillwater her entire life. "Oh, that basement," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Your aunt never spoke much about it, but she told me once it was cursed. Said the house wasn't safe because of what's down there." I laughed nervously, but her expression didn't change. "Cursed? What do you mean?" She hesitated, then leaned in closer. "It's just stories, of course. But people say there's something buried under that house, something that doesn't rest. You'd do well to." Her words stayed with me, and that night the noises were louder than ever. The thuds turned into scratching, as though something was clawing at the other side of the door. The next morning, I decided I couldn't ignore it anymore. Armed with a crowbar, I set to work on the basement door. It took nearly an hour, but eventually, the old wood splintered, and the door creaked open. A damp, musty smell hit me immediately. The basement was dark, the single bulb overhead barely illuminating the space. Dust hung in the air, and the stone walls were stained with what looked like years of water damage. In the center of the room was a large, rectangular slab of concrete. It was cracked and uneven, as though it had been hastily poured. Something about it felt wrong. My skin prickled, and a deep sense of unease settled in my chest, but curiosity pushed me forward. I grabbed a hammer and chisel and began to chip away at the concrete. It was slow, grueling work, and with each strike, the air seemed to grow heavier. After what felt like hours, I broke through. The first thing I noticed was the smell, an acrid, rotting stench that made me gag. Beneath the concrete was a wooden box, its surface blackened and warped. My hand shook as I pried it open. Inside were bones, small, fragile, human. Horrified, I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. But before I could process what I'd found, the temperature in the room plummeted. A low, guttural growl echoed from the darkness. I spun around, my flashlight trembling in my hand. Shadows seemed to move along the walls, pooling in the corners and stretching toward me. The growl grew louder, joined by whispers that sounded like dozens of voices overlapping. Too quiet to understand, but filled with malice. I backed toward the stairs, but the shadows were faster. They surged forward, wrapping around my legs, pulling me down. I screamed, kicking and thrashing, but the grip was unrelenting. And then I saw it. From the darkness emerged a figure, tall, impossibly thin, its limbs too long, and its face obscured by a tangle of black hair. Its eyes were glowing pinpricks of red, and its mouth stretched into a grin that revealed rows of jagged, yellowed teeth. It reached for me with spindly fingers, and as it touched my chest, an icy pain shot through me. "You let me out," its voice echoing inside my head. "Now you're..." The next thing I remember, I was outside, lying on the lawn. My neighbors found me there unconscious and muttering incoherently. I left Stillwater the very next day, abandoning the house and everything in it. But it didn't end there. Even now, in my new apartment miles away, I feel its presence. Shadows linger in the corners of my vision, and at night, I hear faint scratching at the windows. And every so often, when the room is completely silent, I hear its voice. "You let me out." It was supposed to be a quick trip to clear my head. After a brutal week at work, I decided to take a drive through the countryside, far from the city's noise and chaos. I didn't have a destination, just the open road, a tank full of gas, and an old mixtape to keep me company. The sun was beginning to set when I passed through a small town I'd never heard of. A faded sign read, "Welcome to Pine Hollow," but there wasn't much of a welcome to speak of. The streets were deserted, the shops boarded up or empty, and a thick mist clung to the ground. I should have turned around, but something about the town intrigued me. It felt forgotten, as though it had been left behind by time. I decided to stop at a diner I spotted near the edge of town. The neon sign flickered weakly, buzzing like a dying fly. Inside, the place was almost as empty as the streets. A lone waitress stood behind the counter, her back to me. She didn't turn around when the door creaked open, nor when I slid into a booth by the window. "Coffee, please," I called out. She nodded silently, her movements stiff and mechanical, and soon a steaming cup of coffee was placed in front of me. I tried to thank her, but she was already walking away, her head tilted slightly to one side, as if listening to something I couldn't hear. The coffee tasted bitter, but I didn't mind. I stared out the window, watching the mist grow thicker, swallowing the streetlights one by one. That's when I saw him. A man was standing across the street, barely visible through the haze. He was tall, with a wide-brimmed hat that cast a shadow over his face. He didn't move, didn't shift. He just stood there, staring in my direction. Unease prickled at the back of my neck. I turned to the waitress, hoping to ask about him, but she was gone. The diner was completely empty now. Even the air felt different, heavier, colder. When I looked back outside, the man was closer. I froze, my pulse racing. He hadn't walked, hadn't taken a single step, yet he was now standing in the middle of the street. His head was tilted slightly downward, as though he was studying me. I grabbed my keys and left money on the table, the urge to leave growing unbearable. But as I stepped outside, the mist wrapped around me like a living thing, damp and suffocating. "Leaving already?" A voice rasped behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. The street was empty, the mist shifting, like it had a mind of its own. Then I saw the man again, now standing directly in front of my car. He was close enough that I could finally see his face, or the lack of it. His skin was smooth and featureless, like a blank canvas. I didn't wait to see what he wanted. I sprinted to my car, fumbling with the keys as the mist seemed to thicken around me. When I finally managed to start the engine, the headlights illuminated the man, now standing at the driver's side window. His head tilted again, though he had no eyes. I could feel him staring straight into me. "Stay," the voice said again, but it wasn't coming from him. It was inside my head, echoing, twisting. I slammed the car into reverse, tires screeching as I tore out of the parking lot. The man didn't move, but in the rearview mirror, I saw more figures emerging from the mist. Men, women, children, all faceless, all watching. The drive out of Pine Hollow felt endless. The road stretched on forever, the mist swallowing everything behind me. My heart didn't stop pounding until I finally saw the glow of a gas station up ahead. I pulled in shaking as I stumbled out of the car. The attendant looked up from his magazine, startled by my appearance. "Hey, you okay?" he asked. I was in Pine Hollow," I managed. His face paled, and he shook his head. "That's not possible. What do you mean?" "There's no Pine Hollow," he said quietly. "That place burned down 40 years ago. Everyone in the town, they died in the fire. No one's been there since." I didn't argue. I couldn't. Even now, I can't explain what happened that night. But sometimes, when I drive through the countryside, I see the mist creeping along the edges of the road, and I know somewhere in the fog, they're waiting. The wind howled through the trees as I drove down the long, isolated road. The small town where I grew up was a few miles ahead, but the thought of returning stirred up something unsettling deep inside me. I hadn't been back in years. Not since that night, the night everything had changed. I could still hear the echoes of those terrifying moments in my mind, the whispers, the shadows, and the fear that had consumed me. My parents had always been protective, and after that night, they never let me near the town again. But now, with the anniversary of that night approaching, I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to face it once and for all. The car's headlights illuminated the fog that clung to the road, swirling around the tires as if the night itself was trying to pull me back into the darkness. As I neared the outskirts of town, I could make out the outlines of the old buildings, their windows dark and empty. The streets were eerily silent, not a single soul in sight. It was as if the town was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I parked the car near the town square where the old church still stood. Its spire reached into the sky like a finger pointing at the heavens, but there was nothing holy about it. I had never believed in the stories, the legends that my parents used to tell me about the church and the town's history. But now, I couldn't ignore the unsettling feeling that had taken root in my gut. I stepped out of the car, the cold air biting at my skin. The streets were damp from the earlier rain, and the sound of my boots crunching on the wet pavement echoed in the silence. I made my way toward the church, my breath forming mist in the air as I walked. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and a wave of musty air hit me. The church was just as I remembered it, dark, cold, and filled with the scent of old wood and stone. The pews were worn, the candles long extinguished, but something was different. The air felt thick, heavy, as if something was waiting. I stepped cautious on the aisle, my footsteps barely making a sound, and then I saw it. At the altar, the figure that had haunted my dreams for years. It was a woman, or at least it had been. Her face was pale, almost translucent, with hollow eyes that stared blankly at her. Her body was draped in a tattered white gown, the fabric stained with what looked like old blood. Her hair, once dark and full, now hung in matted clumps around her face. She was standing perfectly still, as though frozen in time, but I could feel her presence, cold, suffocating. I froze in place, unable to move, unable to look away. My heart pounded in my chest as I struggled to make sense of what I was. This wasn't just real, and it was waiting. Suddenly, the room seemed to darken, the walls closing in as the air grew colder. I could hear a low, guttural sound, like a growl, coming from somewhere deep within the church. The woman's eyes shifted, her head tilting slowly to one side, as if she were sensing my presence. And then, "You shouldn't have come back." Her voice was a whisper that to echo in my. I wanted to run, escape, but my feet were glued to the ground. I couldn't tear my eyes away. The growl grew louder, and I felt something shift in the room. Something was moving. Something was alive. The shadows began to twist and stretch, crawling along the walls and floor like living creatures. The woman's figure slowly started to move, her limbs jerking unnaturally as she took a step toward me. "Leave this," she whispered, her voice now an urgent hiss, "before it consumes you." But I couldn't leave. I was trapped. The air around me was thick with the stench of decay, and the shadows were closing in, wrapping themselves around me like tendrils, squeezing the life out of me. I could feel the pressure on my chest, like invisible hands gripping my heart. I tried to scream, to call out for help, but no sound came. The woman took another step forward, her eyes locked onto mine with a malevolent gaze. I could feel her presence in my bones, in my very soul, and I knew then that she wasn't human. Whatever she was, whatever had happened to her, it was far beyond anything I'd ever understood. "You were supposed to forget," she said, her voice like nails scraping against a chalkboard. "But now you remember, and now you're here, just like the others." I didn't understand. The others? What others? And then, the truth hit me like a cold wave. The people who had disappeared from this town, the ones who had never been found, had they all come to the church? Had they all been drawn? Here, just like me? The woman before me wasn't a ghost, a memory. She was a part of something much darker, something that had been lurking in the shadows of this town for generations. Suddenly, the growling intensified, and the walls of the church seemed to groan under the pressure. The floor beneath my feet cracked open, revealing a dark pit that stretched down into the earth, as if the church itself was alive, hungry. I tried to run, but the shadows reached out, grabbing hold of me, pulling me toward the open pit. I could hear the woman's voice in my head, a constant, insistent whisper, telling me that it was too late, that I was already a part of the town's curse. Just as I thought I would be swallowed by the darkness, the door of the church slammed open and I was yanked free, thrown out onto the steps of the church. The storm outside had intensified, the wind howling as it whipped through the trees. I scrambled to my feet, my heart still pounding in my chest. I turned to look at the church, but it was gone. The building that had stood so tall just moments ago was now nothing but an empty lot, the ground barren and cracked. There was no trace of the woman, no sign of the shadows that had nearly claimed me. I didn't know what had happened. I didn't know if what I had seen was real or if it was just a manifestation of my own fears. But as I stumbled away from the church, the whispers in my head grew louder, echoing in the wind. And I knew then that the town was still cursed, still waiting for the next person to come back. The Harvest Festival was only the beginning. I've always loved hiking. There's something peaceful about being out in nature, away from the hum of technology and the bustle of city life. So when my friend Eric suggested we explore a trail deep in the woods, near his childhood home, I jumped at the chance. Eric warned me the trail wasn't well known and hadn't been maintained for years, but that only made it more appealing. "It'll be an adventure," he said with a grin. The trailhead was unmarked, hidden behind a dense thicket of trees. We parked the car on the side of a dirt road and pushed through the underbrush until we found it. The air felt cooler in the shade of the towering pines, and the forest was eerily quiet, as if it were holding its breath. The first few hours were uneventful. The path was overgrown, but it was still visible, winding through the trees like a forgotten ribbon. Eric told me stories about the area, local legends about missing hikers, strange sightings, and whispers of a cursed cabin hidden deep in the... I laughed it off, chalking it up to small-town folklore. But as the sun began to dip below the horizon, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. "Let's set up camp here," Eric suggested, pointing to a small clearing. We pitched our tents and built a fire, the flickering flames casting long shadows on the trees around us. As we ate, the forest seemed to grow quieter. The usual sounds of crickets and rustling leaves were absent, replaced by a heavy, oppressive silence. "You hear that?" I asked. Eric looked up from his food, frowning. "Hear what?" "Nothing. That's the problem." He shrugged. "Probably just the wind." But it wasn't the wind. That night I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside my tent. They were slow and deliberate, crunching softly on the forest floor. I held my breath, straining to listen. The steps circled my tent, pausing occasionally, as if whoever or whatever was out there was deciding what to do next. I wanted to call out to Eric, but fear rooted me in place. I clutched my flashlight, my hand trembling, and waited. Eventually the footsteps faded, and the forest was silent once more. The next morning I told Eric what I'd heard. "Probably just an animal," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. We packed up and continued along the trail, But the unease from the night before lingered. The deeper we went, the more the forest seemed to change. The trees grew taller and denser, their branches intertwining to block out the sun. The air smelled damp and earthy, and the path became harder to follow. Then we found it. The cabin was nestled in a hollow, barely visible through the trees. It was old, its wooden walls warped and blackened with age. The windows were shattered, and the door hung loosely on its hinges. Guess the stories were true, Eric muttered. We approached cautiously, our curiosity outweighing our fear. Inside, the cabin was a mess. The floor was littered with broken furniture and debris, and the walls were covered in strange symbols carved into the wood. What do you think this means? I asked, running my fingers over one of the carvings. Eric didn't answer. He was staring at something in the corner, a pile of bones. They were small, too small to be animal bones. We need to leave, Eric said, his voice tight. But as we turned to go, we heard it, a low, guttural growl, coming from somewhere deep within the woods. We froze, our eyes scanning the trees. The growl grew louder, closer, and was soon joined by the sound of branches snapping and leaves rustling. Run, Eric whispered. We bolted, the forest a blur as we tore through the underbrush. The growls followed us, growing more feral, more desperate. I don't know how long we ran, but by the time we reached the car, my lungs were burning, and my legs felt like they would give out. As we sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Something was standing at the edge of the trees, watching us. It was tall and emaciated, its limbs unnaturally long, and its face was wrong. Its mouth was too wide, filled with jagged teeth, and its eyes glowed a sickly yellow. We didn't stop until we were miles away, back in the safety of Eric's home. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that thing standing at the edge of the woods, its gaze burning into me. And sometimes, late at night, I hear footsteps outside my window, slow, deliberate. I don't go hiking. The storm hit unexpectedly. One minute, the sky was clear, and the next, dark clouds rolled in, obscuring the sun and unleashing torrential rain. I'd been driving for hours, trying to make my way back home from a business trip. The roads were winding, and I was deep in a rural area when the storm began. I could barely see past the windshield as the rain poured down in sheets. I needed a place to stop, but there was nothing for miles. That's when I saw the sign, a small, weathered board nailed to a post that read, "The Old Mill Inn, 1 mile ahead." I didn't think twice. A warm bed and a roof over my head seemed like a blessing. As I pulled into the parking lot, the wind howled through the trees, and the sky was now nearly pitch black. The inn itself was an old two-story building, its stone exterior dark and worn from years of neglect. It looked like it hadn't seen a guest in ages, but I was desperate. The door creaked open as I entered, and the scent of wood, dust, and something faintly metallic filled the air. The lobby was dimly lit, and the only sound was the crackling of a fire in the hearth. A woman stood behind the counter. She was tall, with gray hair that was pinned back tightly, and her face was etched with wrinkles, though her eyes were surprisingly sharp. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice low but pleasant. "I was wondering if you had any rooms available," I replied, wiping the rain from my face. She gave me a long, measured look before nodding slowly. "We do, but the storm is bad. I'd suggest you stay the night." Something in her tone made me uneasy, but I nodded, grateful for the shelter. She handed me a key. "Room 7, upstairs. Dinner will be ready in an hour." I thanked her and made my way up the creaking stairs, the wood groaning under my weight. Room 7 was at the end of a long hallway. The door opened with a loud screech, revealing a small, modest room. The bed was neatly made, and a single lamp cast a soft glow across the faded wallpaper. The window was shut tight, but the sound of the storm outside was deafening. I took a deep breath and sat down on the bed, trying to shake off the feeling of unease that had settled in my chest. The storm wasn't letting up, and the loneliness of the place only seemed to deepen the silence. After a while, I decided to go down for dinner. When I entered the dining room, it was like stepping into another time. The table was set with fine china, silverware gleaming in the dim light. There was a fire in the fireplace here too, casting dancing shadows across the walls. The woman who had greeted me earlier was now sitting at the head of the table, a thick pot of soup simmering in front of her. She gestured for me to sit. "You're the only one here tonight, so it's just the two of us," she said with a tight smile. I sat down hesitantly, and she ladled soup into a bowl for me. The smell was savory. The woman watched me intently as I took my first bite. The taste was unlike anything I'd ever had, rich and thick, but with an odd, almost metallic aftertaste. It was so strange that I hesitated, but I didn't want to seem rude, so I forced myself to continue eating. After a few spoonfuls, the door to the dining room suddenly slammed open, and a gust of wind rushed in. A man, drenched from the rain, stood in the doorway. His eyes were wide with terror, and his hands were trembling. I was passing through," he stammered, "and I saw the lights. The storm. It's too much. Please, can I stay?" The woman's expression didn't change, but there was something about the way she looked at him. Cold, calculating. She nodded. Of course. Come in. You'll have dinner. The man stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room, but he didn't seem to notice me. He sat down at the far end of the table, not saying a word. The woman served him a bowl of soup, just as she had for me. For a moment, there was only the sound of the storm outside and the soft clink of spoons against bowls. But then, the man suddenly gasped, his hand shooting up to his throat as though he were choking. His face turned ashen, and his eyes bulged with fear. What's wrong? I asked, standing up in alarm. The woman didn't move, her eyes locked on the man, unblinking. With a final, desperate gasp, the man collapsed forward onto the table, his bowl of soup spilling across the floor. I backed away slowly, my heart racing in my chest. What did you do to him? I demanded, my voice trembling. She didn't answer immediately, but when she finally spoke, her tone was unnervingly calm. The soup. It's always the soup. Before I could ask what she meant, she stood up, wiping her hands on her apron. You'll understand soon enough. I turned and ran, not even thinking about where I was going. I didn't care. All I knew was that I needed to get out of there. I raced up the stairs and into my room, locking the door behind me. My breath came in ragged gasps as I tried to calm myself. But my mind raced. The soup. What had been in that soup? I looked around the room, frantic, searching for something, anything, that could explain what had just happened. That's when I noticed something strange. On the wall, just above the bed, was a small, framed photograph. It was an old picture of the inn from years ago, and standing in front of the building were dozens of smiling faces, dozens of people who looked too similar. The same sharp eyes, the same tight smiles, and in the corner of the photograph, there was the same woman, her eyes glowing with a strange, unsettling light. The storm outside raged on, but inside the inn, it felt as though time had stopped. The next morning, when I woke, the inn was completely quiet. I gathered my things and rushed down the stairs, but there was no sign of the woman or the man who had entered the dining room. The lobby was empty and the door was wide open, letting in the harsh daylight. I stepped outside, the storm finally cleared, but the air felt thick with something I couldn't shake. As I drove away from the old mill inn, I glanced in the rearview mirror. I swear I saw the woman standing in the doorway, watching me, her eyes glowing. I haven't driven through that area since, and whenever I see an old inn or hear about a mysterious bed and breakfast, I remember the old mill, the place where time stands still, and where the soup is always served. It had been weeks since I'd received the invitation to the town's annual harvest festival. I had always been an outsider, someone who preferred the quiet life of a small town without the fuss of social gatherings. But this year felt different. The weather had turned colder, the days shorter, and the town itself seemed to carry an odd sense of anticipation in it. I couldn't explain it, but I found myself intrigued by the idea of attending. The Harvest Festival was an event that had been held in the town for generations. It was meant to celebrate the bounty of the season and bring the community together. The invitation had arrived at my doorstep late one evening, an old-fashioned handwritten note sealed with red wax. The words were simple: join us for a celebration like no other. The Harvest Festival awaits you. That's how I found myself standing at the edge of the town square on a chilly October evening, the festive lights casting a warm glow over the scene. The town seemed to come alive with activity. People were laughing, children were playing, and the scent of roasted corn and cinnamon filled the air. But there was something about the event that felt off. The festival was held in a large open area in front of the town hall, where wooden booths lined the streets, selling everything from homemade crafts to fresh produce. At the center of it all stood a towering bonfire, its flames flickering in the breeze. The fire was the heart of the celebration, and I couldn't help but be drawn to it. As I wandered through the booths, I noticed something strange. The people here, they all seemed too familiar. They were friendly, yes, but their smiles were too wide, their eyes too intense. Every interaction felt rehearsed, as though they had all been waiting for something, for someone to show up. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I tried to ignore the gnawing discomfort in my gut and made my way to the bonfire, where a group of people had gathered. They were chanting something, their voices rising and falling in unison. It was a rhythmic, almost hypnotic sound that seemed to reverberate through the air. The flames crackled, casting eerie shadows on their faces. As I approached, one of the men turned toward me, his eyes locking with mine. "You've come," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "You're just in time." I took a step back, confused and unnerved by his sudden attention. "What do you mean?" "The harvest," he replied, his smile widening unnaturally. "The harvest always needs to be fed." Before I could respond, the crowd around the bonfire fell silent. The chanting stopped, and all eyes turned to the center of the gathering. I followed their gaze and saw a figure step forward from the shadows. It was a woman, dressed in tattered white robes, her face hidden by a dark veil. She held something in her hands, something large, wrapped in cloth. The crowd parted to make way for her as she approached the fire. The man who had spoken to me earlier raised his hands in the air. "The harvest is ready," he announced. "Tonight, we celebrate the fruits of our labor." The woman unwrapped the cloth, revealing a large twisted bundle beneath. My heart skipped a beat as I realized what it was. It wasn't a bundle of vegetables or fruit or any kind of crop. It was a human body. A gasp rippled through the crowd, but no one moved. The woman placed the body at the base of the bonfire, and the flames leapt higher, licking at the air in a fiery dance. The figure in the robes spoke again, her voice low and reverent. "The harvest must be offered," she said. "For the town to thrive, for the crops to grow, the land must be fed. The blood of the harvest keeps the town alive." I felt the bile rise in my throat as the fire roared to life, engulfing the body in flames. But the horror didn't end there. As the fire blazed higher, the figures in the crowd began to chant again, their voices rising in a frenzy. It was then that I understood. This wasn't just a festival, it was a ritual. And I had unknowingly walked right into the heart of it. The flames twisted and warped, and I could swear I saw the face of the body in the fire, twisting, screaming, as if alive. The air was thick with the scent of burning flesh, and the heat from the fire was unbearable. I turned to leave, but the crowd had closed in around me, blocking my path. "You can't leave now," the man said, his smile widening once again. "You're part of it now." I tried to push my way through, but the people around me were too strong. They were all watching me, their eyes glowing with an eerie, unnatural light. I could feel their hands on my arms, pulling me toward the fire. "Join us," the woman in the robes said, her voice almost coaxing, as if inviting me into a secret world I didn't understand. "The harvest needs you." The flames roared louder, and the chanting grew louder still. Panic surged through me as I struggled against their grip. This was no festival. This was a cult, a twisted ancient tradition that had been practiced for generations, and I was the chosen sacrifice. With a surge of strength, I broke free, stumbling backward and running into the woods that border the town. I could hear them chasing me, their footsteps pounding behind me. The sound of the fire and the chanting faded as I ran, but the terror didn't. It was in my chest, my mind, my very soul. I didn't stop running until I reached the edge of town, where the festival was now a distant memory. Hidden behind the trees, I could barely catch my breath, my body trembling from the adrenaline and fear. When I turned back, the town was gone. There were no lights, no signs of life. The streets were empty and the air was still. I haven't gone back to that town. I don't think I ever will. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I hear the chanting, the voice of the woman in the robes calling me to join them. And I can't shake the feeling that the Harvest Festival is waiting for me to return, to complete the ritual that was started long ago. I was almost the harvest, and now I'll never escape it. The rain had been pouring relentlessly for hours as I drove down the narrow, winding road. The headlights of my car sliced through the stormy night, casting long shadows across the dark trees that lined the path. I had taken this route countless times before, just a quiet country road on the outskirts of the small town where I grew up. But tonight felt different. The air was heavy, thick with something I couldn't quite place, something unsettling. I had been away for a while, living in the city for years, far from the small town where I was raised. But when my mother called and told me my childhood home was being sold, I had to return, if only for a few days to say goodbye. The house had stood empty for years after my father passed, and now my mother was ready to move on. I wasn't sure what I expected when I drove back through the town, but the feeling of nostalgia quickly turned into something far darker. As I neared the old house, I noticed something strange. The driveway was lit by a single, flickering street lamp, its dim light barely piercing the darkness. But the house itself, it was different. I had expected it to look the same as it had all those years ago, with the same crooked roof, overgrown yard. Instead, there was a sense of something watching, something waiting. I parked the car and sat for a moment, looking at the house through the rain-streaked windshield. The windows were dark, and the faint outlines of the old oak trees in the yard swayed ominously in the wind. My heart started to race, a chill creeping down my spine. I could feel the weight of the house pressing in on me, as though it had been alive all these years, waiting for me to return. I stepped out of the car, the sound of my footsteps muffled by the heavy rain. As I approached the front door, the old wood creaked under my weight, groaning as if it were alive, reacting to my presence. The door swung open with ease, and I stepped inside. The house smelled musty, filled with the scent of old wood and dust. The familiar creak of the floorboards beneath my feet echoed through the silence. I walked through the dark hallway, running my fingers along the walls, tracing the cracks in the faded paint. There was something wrong, something off about the place. The silence was almost suffocating. I made my way upstairs, my footsteps growing heavier with each step. As I entered the old bedroom, memories flooded back, memories of laughter, of warmth. But something had changed. The room felt colder than it ever had before, and the air was thick with the sense of being watched. I turned toward the window, but it was clouded with condensation, the outside world barely visible. Then I heard it, a soft, rhythmic, a tapping, faint but persistent. My heart skipped a beat. It came from the hallway. I froze, staring at the door. The tapping grew louder, more distinct and closer. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I turned toward the door, my breath shallow and rapid. The sound stopped, and for a moment, everything was still. Then, the door creaked open slowly, as though something or someone was on the other side, pushing it just enough to peek through. There was no one there, but that was not the most unsettling part. The shadows in the hallway beneath the doorframe were moving, slithering. I stumbled back, my heart racing in my chest. The shadows seemed to stretch, twist, and curl in unnatural ways, as though they had a life of their own. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. Suddenly, the room grew colder, and I heard a voice, low and guttural, whisper from the darkness just outside the door. "You shouldn't have come back." I turned toward the window, desperate for an escape, but the glass was now frosted over, covered in what appeared to be small, claw-like scratches. The whispering grew louder, more frantic. "You shouldn't have come back." I ran to the door and slammed it shut, my hands trembling as I fumbled for the lock. The whispers were now a chorus of voices, all chanting in unison, their words incomprehensible, but filled with an eerie, unholy energy. The floor beneath me began to tremble, as if the house itself were alive, and I could hear something moving behind the walls, scraping and scratching. I grabbed my phone from my pocket and dialed my mother. My hand was slick with sweat as I held it to my ear. It rang several times before she picked up. "Mom," I gasped, my voice shaky. There's something wrong with the house? I don't know what it is, but it's..." Her voice on the other end was unnervingly calm. "You should never have come back." The line went dead. The room grew colder still, and the whispers intensified. I could hear them outside the door, behind the walls, beneath the floorboards, and then I saw it. A shadow, dark and possibly large, crawled along the floor, its shape almost human but distorted, grotesque. It slithered toward me, inching closer, its presence suffocating. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening, but there was no logic, no explanation, only fear. Suddenly, the shadow lunged toward me. I screamed, but it didn't matter. The darkness consumed me, dragging me into the very walls of the house. My vision blurred, and the world around me dissolved into a deep, suffocating blackness. When I woke, I was outside, somehow, miraculous, standing in front of the house. The rain had stopped, but everything was eerily quiet. The house, once looming in the distance, now stood silent, unmoving. I could hear the distant hum of traffic, the sounds of the outside world, but it was as though nothing had ever happened. But I knew better. The house was not empty. It had never been empty. And whatever I had seen, whatever I had felt in that house, it was still there, waiting for the next person who dared to come back.